All right, thank you, everybody. So you're at the last panel session of the day and for the ConnectX. We appreciate you all being here. My name is Kyung Moon. I'm a principal analyst with Mobile Experts. We're a market intelligence firm tracking the mobile and communication market. And to my left is Joe Lindholm, is the CEO of Infinergy. And then we have Eric Hudson from Mountain Wireless, and we have William Richmond from Cox. I want to ask each of them to really give their backgrounds and introduce themselves to you. Joe?
Hi, thanks, Kyung. As you said, I'm Joel Lindholm. Kind of a long heritage here in the telecommunications and networking world. For, I guess, probably 6-7 years ago, and the start of the CBRS Alliance, I was with Ruckus. I was one of the founding members of the Alliance, so I ran a business unit for them. After that, I spent some time at Meta for the last 3 years working on kind of internal programs for our properties. Now, just recently stepped out to launch this new company, Infinergy.
Thank you. Eric?
Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Hudson, VP Engineering for Mountain Wireless. We're a member of the Ontivity family of companies, providing coast-to-coast services for wireless implementation. So my specific roles are in RF engineering, primarily in building and venue spaces, working with traditional DAS services for small to large venues, but then also expanding to small cells and private networks as well.
William Richmond. I'm with Cox Communications, specifically Cox Private Networks. Cox Private Networks was launched as a commercial venture at the end of last year. I lead our technology strategy and sales efforts within Cox Private Networks. I've been in this space for quite a while, spanning both licensed, unlicensed, and lightly licensed technologies. Worked with a lot of people in this room.
Fantastic. I shouldn't be asking this question. We have a CBRS historian right next to me here, but obviously, CBRS. This panel is about kind of open spectrum in terms of the CBRS, what opportunities has enabled. And we're going to talk a little bit about Open RAN, not too much in detail, but really this idea that we have openness around spectrum and the different technologies, presumably it would open up new opportunities. So I want to ask the first question to maybe Joe first, and I want to go down the line here. What kind of opportunity has CBRS spectrum really opened up? I mean, it's a citizen broadband radio services here. So I want to maybe ask your perspective on what kind of opportunity has opened up for you.
It's been a game changer. We thought early on that it would be a game changer, and actually, frankly, at the beginning of the Alliance, we had spectrum, and we didn't really know what we were going to go do with it. And over time, we've figured out, okay, fixed wireless access, maybe some extra capacity for the carriers, maybe help some of the MVNO guys with some networking, and then private networks and neutral host for enterprises. Well, took a little while to get to that point, and each of them have actually started to flourish and at different paces. Private networks was something we focused on early on. Being that it was the innovation band, it was spectrum that pretty much anybody could use, and in our cases, we were working with enterprise customers, but it gave them a tool that they could create new use cases with. But that's been a heck of a journey. I think some of you have been along that path with just what is a private network, how do you deploy a private, what are the components, what are the applications, and it's a journey that's still continuing, but I think that you'll see over the next 12 to probably 24 months, you'll see, instead of just some typical push-to-talk and video use cases, I think you'll start to see more immersive applications come on board with it. And the last one is neutral host, which is using it for in-building cellular coverage as an alternative to DAS. And there's a number of different dynamics that come into play with that, but in general, CBRS has opened up, I think, all of those opportunities here in the United States, and it's actually put U.S. in a leadership position globally. Other countries are following suit in maybe not as elegant of a way, but also opening up spectrum for people to use that are other than the mobile operators. Basically, you'll see all the same use cases we're developing here in the United States are applicable in many other countries. So it literally has changed the game on how cellular can be used by people other than just the carriers.
Right. I mean, in addition to the private wireless need, I mean, we're talking about the spectrum that also mobile operators are using as well, right, for mobile offload and things of the sort. I just want to ask maybe Eric, and ask William as well in terms of kind of a readiness, your perspective on kind of readiness of ecosystem, both from the infrastructure and also maybe on the device side.
So I think that we are seeing good development and maturity of early adopters being able to push the market into a position where we're no longer trailblazing, we're no longer taking great risks and really having to answer our own questions, solving unknowns. And we're now entering a place where deployment is much more understandable and really approachable for those who are not historical players in the cellular space, MNOs or those of us who work very closely with them. Really adds another tool in the toolbox for people who, for people, entities, or venues that have needs that are traditionally solved with a commercial network, but for any of a number of reasons don't wish to subscribe to one, but wish to have one of their own. We have many fewer barriers to entry into that space, and the ability to own and control your own network from an approachable perspective, much more democratized than 1 or 2 or 3 nationwide or international networks.
William, maybe you could kind of give us your perspective on the kind of ecosystem readiness as you engage with the different private wireless customers, and maybe you could share any kind of specific case studies around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ecosystem is more robust than it seems on the surface. I think there's a lot of marketing spin that has done a disservice to the industry around sort of some of the use cases that are targeted and some of the concepts that are floated to customers. And there are a lot of devices that are tangible and real today that we can use. The handset adoption is pretty robust at this point. And when you get down to brass tacks and on to the stuff that people are actually doing, the use cases that people actually have that move the needle for their business today, there are solutions. We see a lot of stuff with pretty basic devices, Zebra scanners, mobile phones, all sorts of different things, wireless routers. I mean, this stuff is there. The focus just needs to be more practical and pragmatic about the kinds of problems that we're proposing to solve. And taking down sort of the pie in the sky, robotic surgery and stuff. That stuff's not there yet, and that's okay, because that's not really what the market's asking for anyway.
Just add on to the mobile phone conversation. It's an easy deflection for people that may not want to see it used for mobile phone use cases to say, oh, the devices aren't there. We have 4 years worth of devices on all the flagship phones, so by device penetration, anybody's going to put in an in-building cellular covered network, there's going to be the devices, that's going to be a category of a property that would use that. And then also I think on other devices like the Zebra scanners, push-to-talk phones, there's a plethora of those. An area that I know I've pushed in my recent past is getting video cameras to include CBRS in it, as opposed to having to have a 2-box solution. So you can build the solutions, I guess, is the point there. But I do think there'll be more volume-oriented solutions that emerge onto the market where it'll just make it easier to deploy for people and just lower that barrier to entry. So where there's a will, there's a way. Absolutely right now.
Yeah, I mean, what we observe, seems like a Zebra scanner is something that I always hear from a lot of the private wireless application perspective. And do you see that kind of device needs to come first in terms of having that capability that really drives the market adoption? I'm just curious to get your perspective on that. In terms of, do we need a CBRS enabled or whatever specific spectrum? It doesn't have to be CBRS, or it could be other types of maybe license that needs to have that capability built into the end device to drive the private wireless market. Just want to get your thoughts on that.
I think private network adoption is it's actually slower than everybody thought it would be flying off the shelves. It's going slower than expected, but that's probably for good reasons. In that the idea of it for an enterprise has become hey, I can do a lot of different things with it. It also can become a little paralyzing for them as well. Sure. But if you break it down to the highest value use cases, then I think the device ecosystem is actually there, so the chicken and the egg game is no longer there. And then once you start that foundational network with your first applications, then you can start to layer on more. And so the network at that point will be there, and it makes it easier for people to adopt more devices and more applications. So on that side, I think we're past the, in most cases, the chicken and the egg.
Yep.
Many years ago, it was not the case, but I think we're somewhat past that. I don't know. William, you do this a lot, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I would say that, you know, the mission critical devices support it, right? The nice to have devices are hit and miss, and they'll continue to adopt it more and more, but the mission critical devices are absolutely there and available today.
Yeah, I want to talk about kind of a common problem that you see enterprise wanting to solve with private wireless networking. Obviously, when we think about private network, you know, the Wi-Fi has been kind of incumbent technology, if you will. I mean, that's been in enterprise spaces for decades. I want to get your thoughts, maybe William, as you work with the specific customers or, you know, types of engagements you have had, what kind of problems are they looking to solve with CBRS private network?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problems that exist today are maybe different than the problems we're going to see in the future. The problems that exist today are pretty straightforward and intuitive. We sort of jokingly call them super Wi-Fi, right? Larger coverage areas, higher mobility, pretty straightforward stuff, protected sort of RF assets that, you know, are hived off from other use cases on the network. We don't take the approach of, as a replacement to Wi-Fi. We believe that, you know, in the future we're going to need all of the various spectrum tools in the toolbox to be able to solve the problems, and different spectrums have different characteristics that some are better at certain use cases than others. And, you know, our job with Cox Private Networks is to sit down and understand the use cases that you have, the things that you solve, and to align those specific use cases to the appropriate medium, and then help you develop a dimensioned head net that aligns to your business objectives.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because that's something that common we hear as well. I mean, it's like, you know, we think about, sometimes we kind of position Wi-Fi against, you know, CBRS, whatever other technology, but it's really kind of an parochial and problem, right? So there's always a need for traffic, so people are deploying more different types of networks. I want to get perspective from Eric. I mean, are you seeing the specific issue, you know, problems or specific problems that enterprise is trying to solve? And do you also share the view that William shared, that you're seeing more of a kind of an overlay network deployment versus kind of replacement of existing network?
So replacement occurs quite regularly, but it's typically with age networks. We do see in a lot of mature venues or spaces that those networks, the DAS of 7 years ago has survived 7 years. That's great. That's actually great longevity for what was at the time a cutting edge technology. But the needs have evolved far beyond that. So we see a lot of end users that are approaching these issues in an environment that does not exist anymore, where carrier funding has walked away, or the venue has specific needs. I think most commonly that we encounter is security-based needs, where a private network becomes the shoe-in for the control of information flow. But nowadays, with new technologies, new architectures, and also new spectrum, there's an ability to converge those needs to one specific, not one specific, one general architecture. So now we don't see users needing to be experts in 3 disparate fields or 3 different architectures, but instead we can approach that from a needs-based position and really look at providing a solution instead of just hardware.
Okay. So I want to maybe kind of talk about the concept of, you know, one of the title was kind of Open RAN, but I want to kind of change that terminology to more shareable infrastructure. Do you see when the enterprise deploy private network or maybe even a neutral host network, how much is that infrastructure shareable from your perspective, from deployments you have done across the different use cases or even across different stakeholders? Maybe
Yeah, I think that's a loaded question and topic. cellular spectrum's been usually the carriers, and they deploy it in a certain way in a national kind of scale in a very conservative way because regulatory responsibilities and the services that they require. On the flip side of it, we just given spectrum to the enterprises to do what they want with it. Now it's kind of free willy, do tons of different applications. It's a very dynamic environment. Those two things are fundamentally at odds with one another. I do believe there are ways of doing it, but it has to be done in a very responsible way to make sure that you meet the needs of both environments, and they're very different environments. And so those are thoughts I think that are going to evolve over time. I don't think that's all there today, but like the products, people have been chasing private networks as a product. The concept of neutral host using shared spectrum is brand new, even capable. And so as I think the deployments evolve, as the maturity of the systems evolve, the applications evolve, I think there'll be a lot of learnings that come because of that.
Yeah, and I would add on to that. I mean, I think the adoption is going to happen in sort of a couple of different waves. Some of the industries where private networks can stand alone and can carry the economics of the infrastructure on their own, distribution, manufacturing, ports, like all those sorts of use cases, pretty straightforward. I think the industry's ready for that now. I think we're going to see a lot of progress in that space. Things like hospitals, things like hotels, things like higher ed. You really have to have an infrastructure that is capable of performing multiple functions for multiple different use cases over that shared infrastructure for those to get adopted. Case of hospitality, one of the use cases you hear regularly is the panic buttons, right, or communications for staff. But if you're going to build a dedicated infrastructure for that use case, that becomes very difficult to justify. But if you have a MACH neutral host that you're running over that infrastructure, and you have another PLMN that's running on that you're using for those private cellular use cases, it makes all the sense in the world, and it changes the equation entirely, right? And so I think the industries are going to evolve at different paces based on that. I think MACH neutral host is a very important domino to fall. You think about the in-building space. I mean, 90% of the in-building space doesn't justify a dedicated traditional licensed cellular infrastructure because the ROI is just not there for the number of users. And the other side of it is that outside of an airport or a stadium where you have a single sort of decision maker over that entire populace, when you go into an enterprise office building or even a hospital, you have different departments, different divisions, different tenants, right? And sort of being able to pull them all together to unilaterally agree on a dedicated connectivity infrastructure for the building is very, very difficult. With MACH, right, because you're not making the decision to connect to the network based on the output power, right, or the stickiness of the network in the building, and it's based on a higher level logic that is using a completely different spectrum, right? It changes the dynamic to be much more surgical, where we can have a single gateway in a building on a college campus, and we can put a radio in the basement of one building in the 15th floor of another, and they work exactly the same way as if we were to build the whole building. And that changes that dynamic entirely, and it makes the cost basis, even if the cost basis were in line or uniform with a traditional DAS per square foot cost basis, just the fact that you don't have to build the whole building changes that drastically, right?
Okay, you brought up very interesting word that I've been hearing a lot. So you brought up the MACH. So maybe for the benefit of the audience who may not be familiar, I want to ask Joe. You have lots of experience with MACH, so maybe can you share what it is and why is it important in the context of what we're discussing here?
Yeah, the multi-operator core networks. It's not really it's not a new technology. It's been around for quite a while. It's just not really pervasively been used here in the United States. There's, like for instance, you go to Canada and they share towers and they do it using MACH, and it's a 3GPP mechanism that allows you to share infrastructure, and When you put up a set of radios in the building, using Mach-In as a technology within that, you can broadcast multiple different PLM NIDs, so multiple different networks. So the concept is that you could have a Verizon, an AT&T, a T-Mobile network broadcast there, but you could also broadcast a private network for whatever the local devices are. In which case, then the venue itself can go and deploy an evolved packet core, call it a Druid APC, and their SIMs, and keep that data and that traffic local. And then, adding on kind of what William was saying is, back in our early days in Ruckus, when we started talking about private networks, frankly, we didn't know, we knew everybody could use a private network, but we didn't know the verticalization nature of that. There were some venues like the industrial guys that clearly have an operational benefit to it, and their primary need was private. There were other people that they just wanted to use it as neutral host, and that concept and how we would do that didn't exist. And then there were a lot of people in the middle, the hospitals and the hotels, that they want the private network, but what they need is the neutral host to cover the public-facing side of the services for people coming in and out of the building. And so, being able to go and deploy what it eventually evolved to was taking shared radio infrastructure in the building, using Mach-In as a technology to go and provide the connectivity for both public and private services.
So I want to ask William, then I want to ask to Eric if you could comment on that as well. Is that if you're putting up a private wireless network, do you typically have to consider putting in Mach-In? I mean, do you have to put that into a consideration as you design the network? And if so, what are the issues there that one should think about? Do you have, is that something that typically happens in you design private network?
Yes, we end up finding that there's, especially in the case of working with a venue, with a partner, and being a trusted advisor in that space, we're surrounded by ubiquitous networks that we take for granted exist. Anybody's cell phone, you're walking around with it in your pocket, you expect it to exist to function when or wherever you are. And then when we enter a private network space that is, granted, it's controlled by a separate entity, it's by definition not going to be as ubiquitous. So with the benefits of that control also come the consequences of its holes. Being able to leave a network is a difficult thing to do, thanks to excellent work by all the carriers in the same space. But it happens all the time in private networks. So we work explicitly to help navigate those consequences, mitigate them, and help provide the seamlessness that users are accustomed to, while also helping them not misunderstand what that network is going to provide, what its costs are going to be in terms of their operations. And that definitely comes at design time.
Right, okay. William, you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I would say that the other element is that the capacity profiles of private cellular networks are typically drastically different than a public cellular network. The devices are not as dense typically in a private cellular network. High power outdoor radio may be sufficient for a private cellular use case where they're using tablets for point of sale or something like that, but that same deployment strategy is not going to work for a public cellular overlay because the device densities could be much higher. So it's sort of you really have to understand and try to dimension the networks appropriately at the outset to give yourself enough room for scale in the future if you want to densify and do Mach-In. But we're also trying to be very intentional about the networks that we deploy to be capable of doing it in the future.
And on the device consideration, right, the needs of the push-to-talk phones that your security guards might have, or put video on there, and the profile of video throughputs is going to drastically change the capacity in the radio. At the same time, you've got these public mobile phones in there that have, guy needs to dial 911, what's going to happen, right? There's very real considerations that need to be there when you're dealing on public neutral host networks and combining it with the private networks. Part of that is the design considerations up front. I suspect that most of the private networks are going to start with a few applications, and then when they see the benefits of that, there's going to be more and more applications. So it's not even just at the start of it. It needs to be something that's monitored and managed on an ongoing basis to make sure that you don't starve one set of applications for the other.
I see. You know, we want to make this conversation as interactive as possible. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and state your name and, okay. I know.
Don't hesitate.
Hi there, Dean Bubley from Structural Analysis. Yeah, I've been following private cellular since 2001, so it's interesting to see the inflection point. Most of the existing private cellular networks around the world are using dedicated spectrum for, it could be like a geofence around a factory or a railway line or something like that. How are you finding enterprises dealing with the shared nature of GAA, CBRS, which is slightly less predictable in comparison to, say, Germany or UK or Japan, where you can say, I want 100 megahertz for these 5 square miles from my airport. Yeah, but it's mine. Yeah, how is the variability of GAA? Do enterprises care? I mean, I guess if you're a mine, it's underground.
Yeah,
you haven't got to worry about it.
It's venue specific, application location specific. So yeah, if you're in a mine, you probably have tons of spectrum for you. If you're in the middle Manhattan, you probably have some different considerations, but you're not also operating tractor trailers and stuff like, you know, whatever, dump trucks, right? So it is a very specific thing. I'd probably, and it just needs to be done appropriately. If you're bringing in licensed spectrum, then you're obviously tying your ship to one particular horse. The opposite side of it, you get the flexibility that comes with CBRS or any of the shared spectrums. I think one of the things that maybe the rest of the world is missing out on is the dynamic nature of CBRS and the SAS. And it, yeah, early on, like, they didn't want to be, I think the SAS people did themselves a disservice by not preaching the automation that it is, because the fact that you can go and plug in a radio and it goes and it gets its spectrum and you don't have to deal with any of it, and it is coordinated across the country, is a huge advantage. I know CBRS Alliance is an effort to take resiliency of that network to another level, so that if you're in a building, you're probably pretty well covered. If you're in some proximity, you're probably okay, but outside, it can be the Wild West a little bit. And so those are definitely things that you need to take into consideration as you're deploying a private network, for sure.
Yeah, I would say in most of our deployments, especially in building, the spectrum is wide open. There's nothing there. You know, I do think it is helpful, like for Cox, for example, having the PALs that we can provide to customers on the back end, you know, for at some sort of premium or however we want to offer them, to be able to have that extra layer of protection. But to date, it really hasn't been necessary. I do think that there is probably a need, more generally across the industry, for just better sort of practices around outdoor deployments and maybe some sort of control. I mean, we've seen, and maybe it's just a product of the times and they'll eventually go away on their own, but we've seen a lot of municipalities that have slapped up 20, 30, 50 radios, you know, and turned them up to 11, and there's not a single device connected, and they're just polluting space.
The example I was thinking is last weekend, the coronation in London, there was a private network outside Buckingham Palace for the broadcasters, who obviously have some pretty tight requirements on availability. And I was wondering whether something similarly sort of mission critical would work on outdoor CBRS in a center of a city at the moment, or whether it's just different use cases working better in different parts of the world.
I mean, in some places we could. I mean, you know, some cities are going to be harder than others, but that's where, you know, especially outdoors, the PALs are going to be an important element.
I mean, the NFL obviously is using it, and they're using it in a controlled, highly reliable way in a very Wild West environment. And so you'll see that evolve more and more over time as the use case and the applications, they know it needs to evolve. So.
think there was a question down here. Oh, can you wait for, there's a mic coming your way.
Tony Tam, CIG. For neutral host, usually the NMO has its own spectrum. Why do they use CBRS for neutral host?
They don't.
Then
It's the
why-
other way. It's the other way around. And when you think about everybody runs a business, right? If you're an MNO, you run a business to service your subscribers, and they buy spectrum in order to do that in a very effective way. If you put the other hat on and you're a venue owner and you want coverage, do you want coverage by one MNO or do you want coverage by 3 MNOs? It's a little different conversation. If you want the one MNO, they can bring in their spectrum. If you want all 3, three have to bring in their spectrum, and that comes with the headaches that have come from DAS for years, and it's pain points, it's months worth of negotiations, it's deployments and costs for everybody involved with it. By using CBRS in the shared spectrum, you get to alleviate most of those conversations. And so,
What is the use case for CBRS neutral host?
what's the use case for it? In-building coverage at a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time.
Yeah, so it's neutral.
Neutral host here.
Yeah, so it's neutral spectrum. It's not any one of those mobile network operator spectrum, right? It's publicly available spectrum. And basically, you are curating access for the mobile network subscribers, right? They basically walk by, they see their network identifier being broadcast on that infrastructure, and they say, hey, that's an AT&T network, I'm going to try to join it, right? And basically, because it's not AT&T's spectrum, you don't have to try to coordinate that spectrum with all of the surrounding AT&T spectrum outdoors, right? So the whole implementation side, the whole coordination side goes away because it's just specific to that site. And then that device tries to connect, and we basically proxy their connection requests back to that mobile network operator, just like a Wi-Fi offload concept, right? And then that mobile operator says, yes, that's one of mine, please let them on. And then that person is connected to that infrastructure and able to use that infrastructure in a seamless fashion without actually having to, open the captive portal and type in the terms of service.
Okay, so
Well
MOCON
done.
will take care of that for the mobile operator then, right? They'll send a signal through the MOCON to different operator then.
So
Yes.
what happens is the radios transmit the signal that your phone sees. So sees a AT&T or a T-Mobile signal or whatever, right? And so it connects and then it gets routed back to the carrier. So you as a user don't need to make any changes to the phone, right? You don't have to go put a second SIM in. You don't have to go and find Wi-Fi and passcode, right? You just walk in and out of the venue, and it looks like the native network from the mobile operators, right? And that's why when I was saying that there's responsibilities inherent by that is because it carries the traffic that the carriers are responsible for in a way from a regulatory perspective. So it has to be done in a kind of responsible way, but it greatly eases the adoption and how easy it is for a building owner to go and put in that infrastructure, and how much lower cost it is for everybody involved. So there's a number of huge benefits.
Thank you.
Eric, you have
Yep.
something to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the advantage of being able to serve multiple PLMNs in an environment with a shared channel, so it's the same channel as opposed to frequency diverse carrier licensed spectrum where a carrier has its own channel and it's that. Now this channel is broadcasting as each one of those entity holders' channels to be used individually and ad hoc by the device, and authenticated on the network natively. And really it opens the door for those historically underserved spaces where they didn't have the funds to support a true neutral host DAS, and didn't have a particular position where a single carrier solution was going to work, say in a corporate headquarters, somebody who has a corporate account and can leverage that account to get dedicated services by one carrier. If they want to serve all the carriers, that the only historical avenue was a traditional DAS. Well, now, not only can we allow a venue to have their cake and eat it too, but also to do that within a framework of solving heretofore non-existent problems or things that they hadn't even considered. That's where the use cases come in. So now, instead of having to address each one of them individually and make a series of very complex decisions on how somebody wants to solve their own series of problems, now we're focusing on a general purpose infrastructure that streamlines a lot of those needs.
Yeah, we often think about the underserved, digital divide in the context of rural, but there's a kind of underserved buildings in the urban markets too, right? So you have, I think the last stat that I remember seeing is like there are over 5 million buildings in the U.S., right, under like 500,000 square foot, but between 100 and 500, it's like even over 100,000 buildings. So there's some buildings, because as we think about 5G and higher frequency, and the modern materials, some of the RF signal or the cellular signal doesn't get through in or out. So there's underserved buildings, right? So that's where I think, as Joe was talking about the MOCN and the neutral host, this is where maybe the CBRS spectrum can play a role. Kind of that relates to my next question: is that who's best qualified or who's best positioned to provide this kind of a neutral host service? And I just want to get your perspective, and maybe. Related to that is what do you think needs to happen in terms of industry collaboration to make that a success?
Wow.
Anyone want to tackle this?
There's a lot there. Do you want to start?
Yeah. So
He tackles all the hard ones.
I think we learned a lot from the Passpoint days and the Wi-Fi offload days, right? I think we have to be cognizant of who all the parties are in the mix. I think it's in the best interest of the carriers to normalize and align their interconnects to a few providers of MOCN services to minimize the threat vectors into their cores. If we try to go with this scattershot approach of everybody taking their private core and trying to get a MOCN connection to the carriers, we're all going to be piled up at the gate and nobody gets through. So there are going to be people that do it well. It's going to be a very specialized industry that, there's going to be stringent SLA reporting and metrics back to the carriers around the KPIs. And so, I think we're going to see a few horses. But, I think broadly as an industry, once those MOCN, and I use the term MOCN separately from the RAN and the infrastructure side, once those MOCN providers materialize and really start getting traction, right, then collectively the industry can go and be sort of the front of the funnel and build those infrastructures, maintain those infrastructures, be the boots on the ground, and deliver for our customers. I mean, this is a need we see all over the place. One of the most common use cases that I actually see coming in through our funnel is for schools. They run these green drills, which is an active shooter drill, and the teachers don't have access to FirstNet. So they need to be able to make a phone call and they can't do it. And a school doesn't have the budget for a DAS, and they need 3 carriers, and the carriers don't have an ROI, so it's a chicken and the egg, and they're stuck. But it's a real problem.
Yep.
Right?
That's truly a real problem.
Yeah, so I think I think like you were saying, a couple of MOCN providers. The thing we still can't get past is carrier adoption. It may not necessarily be their spectrum. Of course, it could be if it's multi-operator RAN, which we didn't talk about, but very similar, a couple more barriers. But the major thing is the carriers are still involved, and I think a much more guarded deployment rather than Wild West race to first, to take a much more measured procedure to end up with a better result. Perhaps not so hastily achieved. So a couple key players, very intentional deployment with measured results that are able to drive the industry much more responsibly.
Joel?
Fully agree. I've spent the last 3 years going down this journey, and the learnings along the way are you have to think almost like a carrier, because it's an extension of the carrier's network, and you don't see hundreds of people out there doing that. And so that's where I was kind of saying is the enterprise with a private network can do kind of whatever they want to do, but there'll be an entity here, which frankly what we'll do is a neutral host operator, where they're thinking like a carrier, but applying it to a local venue because of the responsibilities that come of that. And it's in a, Mach and everybody throws around Mach. Mach is a technology. A neutral host operator is the entity that's doing this thing. And so there's other business elements to it. So if you think from a carrier perspective, right, they can't fund the DAS, or they're going to fund these. Like there's some specific things that need to be done there, as well as the relationships with them. So I agree with a few number of trusted kind of entities that think like a carrier, but can help deliver it to the scale. And the unserved areas where that's the biggest need, right? You can put a DAS in a large venue, in a stadium or in an airport or something like that. That'll be there. Some really large buildings, you could still put a DAS, or you could use a shared spectrum, a neutral host. But then there's all the rest of the properties that are underserved or unserved and have critical needs. And so if done right, it can be a good thing for the carriers, and it can be a good thing for the venues. If done incorrectly, it can go sideways quickly. So.
How ready are the infrastructure? Like, we haven't talked about core network. How ready is the core network ecosystem, the RAN, and so forth to enable, we're talking neutral host network or private wireless network? I want to get your thoughts there, Joe.
I mean, frankly, as we built this, we've used existing technologies, so it's not like that piece of it's a magic. But there's certainly a maturity that's still going to need to be there, and there's a confidence that has to be built with the carriers so that they are more and more comfortable with doing this versus being restrictive. But technology-wise, I mean, I think a lot of those barriers have been broken down, and the various different services required for deployment.
William and Eric,
Yeah,
what's your view on that?
I think the majority of the obstacles have been overcome at this point, but I do think you'll start to see a shift in the product roadmaps of the OEMs as this starts to take off. It's been very myopic on the private use cases and not so much on the Mach-in, right? And the economics are going to need to change in the Mach-in construct, the performance characteristics, the back-end interfaces, and all the metrics that come out of the radios. Like, that's all going to change, but I think they'll start to prioritize those products and features more now when Mach-in takes off.
And if you think about macro cells, massive MIMO, right? Oh, okay, we're getting down to these small cells, and they're kind of certain form factors, but there's a lot of venues out there that you take advantage of this, and they all can't afford a big, expensive radio. There'll be proliferation of, to William's point, right? The OEMs that are making product will diversify those. Operational efficiencies will be gained, and it'll help it move to just, I think, more broad adoption over time.
Okay, very good. So maybe the final question, if I could, I want to get your perspective. We've been talking about neutral host networking, private networking. What needs to come first? What do you think is going to come first to drive the market in terms? Is that neutral host network? Network that's designed for neutral host first, or is that more of a private network application that's going to drive the adoption of CBRS network?
I think the private networks will come first, just by necessity, in understanding the players in the room. The private networks will come first. I think the private networks coming first and getting traction is actually going to be beneficial to the Mach-in and neutral host efforts later on. There's a lot of companies that have spent a lot of capital developing this stuff, and the market needs to start gaining traction for them to continue sinking those R&D funds in.
I think that I agree. The private networks are where the funds are available with those users who have a need that they are willing to pay for. What I think that will do is that will drive an alignment on the carrier side to look at these opportunities as places where they were not going to invest capital anyways. That's why they don't have a network. But now they can have aligned objectives to be able to take advantage of something they didn't have to pay for. And the carriers, I remember when the carrier-based Wi-Fi was great. The Wi-Fi offload was awesome because they got capacity offload that they didn't have to pay for. Well, we already know they're not going to pay for many of these things, but as these deployments occur and the carriers are able to see that, that they can take advantage of that and they can play along and it works to everybody's benefit, the same objective is aligned, and I think that's what's going to drive it towards a much more, a much greater deployment and adoption.
I may be the contrarian in the group there then.
That's good.
Well, just it's an obvious pain point of needing and building cellular coverage. Enterprises are still trying to figure out, in a lot of cases, what they're going to do with their private network. And in firsthand experience, like, here's a network to the application people, and they're like, oh, well, all they know about is their devices and their push-to-talk phones. And then they have to go to the application. Like, there's these layers of things that have to happen for adoption on the private network side versus, and so in some verticals, that's going to be 100% their need. In a large number of the verticals, they know they need coverage. They need in-building coverage. And so I guess maybe I'm coming to is it's a vertically specific answer, probably, depending on where you're at in that conversation.
Private networks needs to take off first, but it won't hit its stride until Mach-E
Yes.
materializes.
And to ride the fence as well. Hate to do it, but I think I think that private networks is where the development occurs, where the dollars will be spent. But that's the smaller player. I think the real gem of the whole thing is the ability to deploy a single general purpose network. The private network is just what gets it off the ground.
There's a question here.
Yeah, we're 6 years into CBRS. Have any of you actually connected a neutral host CBRS network to the carrier?
Yes.
Are we talking 1, 2,
3.
3 carriers in a venue?
That
based
based
on
on
a
a specific application?
Sorry?
Is that based on a specific application though?
Neutral host. Mobile phones.
Getting different.
Yeah.
So what?
So I'll point you to, I moderated a panel at Mobile World Congress that was, had all 3 carriers on stage talking about our program with innovation, collaboration, and basically some of the findings of it. And so, yeah, they're on the web.
Right, the hurdle has been that they haven't wanted to do this,
Oh, that's true.
right? I mean, not that we can't, I think we all understand that technologically we can, it's that they won't.
Yeah, but I think if you just look at the economics, right, that, like, so subscriber growth is not going up, right? It's pretty much stagnant at this point, right? And so, the densification necessary to achieve the capacities, the coverage, the expectations that everybody has around connectivity these days and is going to keep increasing in the future, you have to shift the business model, right? And so in order to densify those networks, in order to move the radios closer to the end user, in order to get those infrastructures in the buildings, you have to shift the cost basis of those infrastructures to the building owner themselves as sort of a fourth utility model, right? You don't pay for the water company doesn't pay for the pipes in your building, the electric company doesn't pay for the wires, right? So this is a fourth utility model, but it's not gonna work until we have the infrastructure there to support it, and we have to find a more efficient way to deliver that infrastructure. Mach-E neutral host is the only way to do that efficiently, cost efficiently today. And so whether they like it or not, they're going to have to do this, or subscribers are gonna start complaining, start turning over, and it's gonna be a more localized delivery.
Let me give a little bit of color on this too. I'm sorry, just let me finish up with this. Technology is one thing, business model is another thing. Helping the MNOs understand that there can be goodness for them as well. It was a journey. I think most people in the industry have lived in it, so why are they going to do this? Will they ever do it? I'll call that kind of thing. But the goal was to make sure that we had developed it, deployed it, operationalized it, and have them basically endorse the fact that this was a viable thing. And so, but it's not ready for everybody to come. What I was talking about in terms of, we talked about very specific, small group of neutral host operators that are trusted, that can deploy this thing, because it has the huge promise, but it has to be done in a very kind of controlled way. And so, yeah.
This question right there.
Hey, Ted Cosgrove, GDIT. That scenario where you've built out a private network for an enterprise, it's been designed, it's been built. Are you finding that it is that enterprise's IT shop that then takes the maintenance from that point for that network? How is that piece of it working?
No, so all of our deployments we deliver as a turnkey network as a service offering and manage those on an ongoing basis. I think more enterprises may start to become savvier at that moving forward. It also has a lot to do with the deployment and the architecture that they leverage. I mean, if you build a Ferrari with 5,000 levers and you try to hand it off to an enterprise IT team, they have no idea what to do with it. But if you can make it look and smell and feel like Wi-Fi,
It's some semi-vertically specific too, right? So what William's talking about, larger industrial, highly operational requirements, right? It needs to be done specifically, and if that IT department doesn't have the skills, likely not, somebody can come in and run that as a service for them. I think there's another category of customers that would say, hey, give me the broader kit and I'll go deploy it and I'll figure it all out. And then there's some that'll say, hey, look, I'm gonna take, and I just have a point level application, or just give me an EPC and a SIM, and then they'll go figure out how to make that happen for whatever the scale in their applications are. So I think all of that stuff's gonna evolve, but in general, like the IT departments aren't sitting there waiting for this thing to pop in. They likely don't have cellular skills sitting there, and it's probably going to the Wi-Fi guy's camp, and he's got 2 of them, and they're starving because of all the problems they have with it. So,
yeah.
They need some people that can help them go.
yeah, and I
resolve
think
it.
they want to be in the mix, and they want to have some semblance of control over it. But I think their control and their sort of use for it is much more rudimentary than what's actually going on behind the scenes. And so our job is to abstract that, give them a dozen levers that they can pull. They can provision a SIM card, they can give it an application steering profile, like very, very, very basic stuff in layman's terms that they can use, but abstract all of the complexity behind it. So they are interfacing with it and using it, but it looks like what they're used to. They understand the size and the scope of what they're managing.
And to add on to that, I think that the trusted partner profile becomes very critical. Coming from legacy DAS and some of the most complex networks that are built in a single venue, even the carriers follow the trusted partner model. We have a lot of venues that we've done traditional DAS in for a decade now, and it really is just because we know the networks better, the carriers' networks better than the own carriers. So I think there is some element of putting the right people in the driver's seat, but only in the things that they really care about, and then following up on those sides with expertise that helps make that seamless for them. The carriers have entire dedicated engineering departments, resources, and programs to operate their network. Well, functionally and technically, this is the same network. It's the same protocols. Everything operates similarly, but it can't as a democratized product to a bunch of more or less laymen. So there's a lot of hand-holding that occurs already, and that's really what makes this successful, is helping a user experience be seamless and pulling all the levers that somebody else thinks may not even exist, being the puppet master, if you will.
I'll amplify the trusted partner part of that. Like, you need to be the people, and I think Eric's in the right camp for this, that they need to be people who are going to stay with the journey the entire time, not go sell them a product and run the other way, right? Because it's going to take time, and it's going to evolve, and you don't just want to just quick hit and get out of there. You need to have longevity with the equipment, the customer, the applications, and whatever else is happening in the venue.
Well, it sounds like the telecom industry in general and this show in particular. So I just want to thank the panelists. Please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you.